The failed experiment of containment. We return to the grim heart of Philadelphia's crisis, but our focus has shifted. For years, the official policy regarding Kensington was unspoken but clear: containment. Keep the suffering, the addiction, and the chaos within a specific boundary, Kensington Avenue, and protect the rest of the city. This strategy was not a cure. It was a societal firewall, a political act of sacrifice meant to preserve the property values and quality of life for the surrounding neighborhoods. This policy, fundamentally built on moral abdication, has now failed spectacularly. The contagion of despair has breached the wall. The invasion of the neighborhoods. Fentanyl is not a disease that respects zoning laws or political boundaries. It is a social vector, feeding on poverty, hopelessness, and policy inertia. Today, the crisis is aggressively spilling over, moving south and west into surrounding historically stable working class and immigrant communities like Fairhill, Port Richmond, and McPherson Square. The visual evidence is undeniable. Where there was once only one block of open-air drug markets, there are now 5. Needles, discarded bedding, and the catatonic presence of Tranq users are appearing near playgrounds, schools, and churches. This isn't just a humanitarian expansion. It is an economic and public safety invasion that proves the core truth of our investigation. When a city fails to heal its deepest systemic wound, that wound will inevitably fester and consume the entire body. The comfortable lie that Kensington was an isolated problem has been violently exposed. The policy calculus of abandonment. The containment model operates on a cynical calculus. It assumes that the cost of policing, cleaning, and managing the crisis within a small area is politically cheaper and less disruptive than the cost of truly solving it, which requires vast investment in housing, mental health, and economic reconstruction. Philadelphia was willing to pay the price of one dying neighborhood to save the image of the rest of the city. But the price they paid was moral debt. The continuous visibility of the crisis led to a desensitization among political leaders and the general public, allowing the crisis to metastasize unchecked for years. This deliberate inaction eroded the social capital of the entire region. The displacement dilemma and citizen fury. When city officials finally implement aggressive cleanup sweeps, the only immediate result is the predictable displacement of the crisis. Pushing addicts and the homeless out of Kensington Avenue does not solve addiction. It simply exports the drug market and the humanitarian suffering to the next vulnerable block, often one populated by working-class families with limited resources to fight back. We are documenting the growing fury of citizens in these newly affected areas. Citizens who feel that the government is not solving the problem, but merely re-gifting it to a neighborhood that has less political voice. Mapping the spillover, the new front lines. Our investigation uses visual evidence to map the specific geographical expansion. The crisis has moved beyond the original containment zone, establishing new footholds around key transit nodes and public spaces. McPherson Square, once a community park and library hub, has become a secondary encampment and open-air drug market. Blocks radiating from the L, the elevated train line, now show increasing evidence of drug activity and discarded needles. Areas of historical Hispanic and Latin American settlement are now struggling with the double burden of systemic poverty and a new wave of lethal external drug activity. The economic cost of this spread is immense. Businesses in the spillover zones face immediate collapse and property values plummet, threatening to turn stable, diverse neighborhoods into the next Kensington. The normalization of decay and citizen flight. This geographical shift is accompanied by a severe cultural trauma. As the crisis normalizes, working-class families who have held on to their homes for decades are finally being forced to leave. They are facing an agonizing choice: stay and expose their children to open drug use, discarded human waste, and violence, or abandon the only community they have ever known. This phenomenon, which we term crisis-driven flight, destabilizes the remaining community structures, making the areas even more vulnerable to takeover by drug networks. The containment policy failed not only the addicts, but also the innocent, hardworking families who are the true collateral damage of systemic inaction. Beyond containment, the systematic cure. The failure of the containment model forces a radical shift in perspective. The solution to the Kensington spillover is not more policing or more aggressive sweeps. It is to treat the root causes with the scale and investment required. This demands a massive, coordinated federal, state, and municipal strategy focused on two parallel efforts. First, the immediate implementation of evidence-based medical treatment, including specialized facilities for tranq withdrawal and long-term supportive housing, treating addiction and homelessness as the infectious public health emergencies they are. The moral imperative of reinvestment. Second, we must address the economic foundation that caused the problem, the systemic neglect of the working class. True recovery requires the kind of economic reinvestment that brings dignity back to these areas through funding for infrastructure, education, and industries that provide stable, living wage union jobs. The cost of this comprehensive plan will be massive, but the cost of continued inaction, measured in lives lost, communities dissolved, and public health crises spreading, is demonstrably higher. The money currently being wasted on cycling individuals through the jail and emergency room systems must be redirected to building sustainable solutions. The choice before Philadelphia. The Kensington spillover is Philadelphia's final warning. The choice is clear. Continue the policy of containment, which guarantees the crisis will infect the entire city, or commit to a massive mobilization of resources to treat the deep, systemic wound of poverty and addiction. The uncomfortable truth is that we cannot afford to look away any longer. The collateral damage of this political indifference is now arriving at the doorsteps of every neighborhood. The cynical calculus and moral abdication of containment. The containment model operates on a deeply cynical and economically flawed calculus. The central hypothesis was that the cost of policing, superficial cleanup operations, and constant crisis management within a 5-block radius would be demonstrably cheaper and, more importantly, politically quieter than initiating a full-scale, multi-billion-dollar program for permanent supportive housing, specialized medical treatment, and systemic economic revitalization. This approach was a profound act of moral abdication, allowing human beings to suffer visibly under the pretense of managing an unsolvable problem. The result of this political apathy was not equilibrium, it was the inevitable metastasis of the crisis. The destabilization mechanism, exporting misery. When municipal authorities finally implement aggressive cleanup sweeps in response to public outcry, the outcome is never a resolution. It is simply the predictable displacement of the drug market and the humanitarian population. Pushing addicts and the homeless out of the Kensington Avenue core does not solve addiction, it merely exports the problem to the next vulnerable block. Often a quiet residential street populated by low-income families, elderly residents, and immigrant communities who lacked the political capital to fight back. This cynical strategy of exporting misery not only fails the addicts, but actively destabilizes the surrounding communities. The government becomes a direct actor in spreading the crisis. The economic and social contagion. The residents in these newly infected zones are not facing a temporary nuisance. They are confronting a severe economic contagion. Businesses in the spillover areas face immediate collapse, and long-term residents are forced into agonizing decisions. Stay and expose their children to needles and violence, or abandon their family homes and flee the city, a process we call crisis-driven flight. This phenomenon actively destabilizes the remaining community structures, making the areas even more vulnerable to takeover by drug networks. The cartography of collapse, new frontiers. Our investigation utilizes empirical data and visual mapping to chart the specific geographical expansion. The crisis has definitively moved beyond the original containment boundaries of Kensington Avenue, establishing new, active footholds around key municipal and residential nodes. We observe a sharp increase in activity radiating outwards from the L, the elevated train line, along new arterial routes. Areas like McPherson Square, once a municipal park and library hub, a civic symbol, have been entirely co-opted, becoming a secondary permanent encampment and open-air drug market. Blocks, historically populated by Hispanic and Latin American working-class families, are now struggling with the existential weight of systemic poverty combined with a new, lethal wave of external drug activity disrupting established cultural fabrics and community safety. The ethical vacuum and citizen abandonment. This geographical shift is accompanied by a severe cultural and political trauma that impacts the entire civic contract. As the crisis normalizes in new areas, working-class families who have held onto their homes for decades, often through immense personal sacrifice, are finally being forced to flee. They are facing an agonizing choice: remain and subject their children to discarded biowaste, open drug use, and unpredictable violence, or abandon their ancestral homes and their entire support network. This phenomenon highlights a profound ethical vacuum within city governance. The containment policy failed not only the addicts who were supposed to be helped, but also the innocent, tax-paying families who are the true collateral damage of decades of calculated political inaction and indifference toward the vulnerable. The imperative of strategic resource mobilization, the Kensington spillover, demands a radical pivot away from the failed containment philosophy. The solution is not more policing or aggressive sweeps which merely destabilize the crisis, but to treat the systemic root causes with immediate strategic resource mobilization. This requires a simultaneous, massive federal, state, and municipal strategy focused on two key areas. First, the immediate implementation of robust, evidence-based medical treatment infrastructure, including specialized facilities for complex tranq withdrawal and long-term supportive housing, treating addiction and homelessness as the infectious public health emergencies they are. This requires overcoming the political resistance to building appropriate facilities in every neighborhood, not just the impoverished ones. Economic dignity and the final CTA. Second, we must address the ultimate failure: the systemic economic abandonment of the working class. True recovery requires the kind of comprehensive economic reinvestment seen in post-war eras, funding for infrastructure, high-wage technical education, and decentralized manufacturing that restores dignity and purpose. The cost of this comprehensive plan will be massive, but the long-term cost of allowing the contagion to spread, measured in lives lost, communities dissolved, and political legitimacy eroded, is demonstrably higher. The time for managing the status quo is over. Share this documentary to expose the systemic failure of the containment model and commit to rebuilding America's forgotten heartland. Subscribe to America's Uncomfortable Truth as we continue to investigate the crises others turn away from. Final CTA. This is a fight for the future of Philadelphia and every major city dealing with a drug and homeless crisis. Share this documentary to expose the failure of the containment model. Subscribe to America's Uncomfortable Truth as we continue to hold the system accountable for the systemic crises that are consuming America's cities.